start the recording as well. Yeah. So welcome everybody. Welcome in our third meeting of the Decolonisation seminar series, Unsettling Knowledge, in which we try to unsettle a lot of fixed or semi-fixed notions of the way we think about reality and academic issues. We always try to maybe think if there is a way to maybe even decolonize our knowledge, and that is the question we are exploring in this year-long series. The third talk today is actually about literature, not about linguistics as such. We made a little mistake there, I think, or there was sort of was a slight misinterpretation in what we were doing exactly, but I am nonetheless very, very happy that Giti Chandra has agreed to speak to us about her work. She is currently working at Reykjavik University, where she teaches, or in Reykjavik, where she teaches at the University of Iceland, and she has been an associate professor at the Department of English at St. Stephen's College in Delhi. She has taught and has been a fellow at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and she was also trained at New Delhi, and she has an impressive list of publications at this point. A few I would like to point out. One of them is Narrating Violence, Constructing Collective Identities, To Witness These Wrongs Unspeakable, published in 2009. But she also has, and this is what I find even more impressive, she's the author of a book of Guardians trilogy, The Fangs of Summoning, The Bones of Stars, and The Eye of the Archer. And we are really keen to hear more about her work and how she views her field and what we should take away from the work she's doing. We are all ears at this point. We will have, after the presentation by Giti, we will have a Q&A session. You can, during the presentation, ask questions in the chat, and you can also, if you would need to, send an email to the Decolonisation group at gmail.com if you don't have access to the chat, which is possible if you don't have the app to this. And all this can be rewatched on our YouTube channel, where you can also see the previous installments of our series. So Giti, we love to hear you now.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Rachel, and everybody here. This is, as I was saying, it's a great initiative. And there's lots of appreciation. I don't know if riches will follow, but lots of gratefulness. I actually hadn't realized, Frank, until you mentioned the fantasy series, that there's a good bit to be said there about decolonization of writing, especially fantasy into the English-speaking world. But I can leave that for questions. I hadn't actually thought to include it in my presentation, which is very serious otherwise. And so, but sure, if anyone is interested, that's actually something I've thought a great deal about, and I'm very happy to share my experiences. So I'm going to now share. Am I sharing?
Yes, great.
Oh, really?
Yes, we can see it.
Yep, perfect.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, I'm trying to find it I can't actually see it on my screen, which is weird. I could see it last time. It says change share. Nope, this is the one I want, right?
Yep, what we see at the moment is the header slide with Unsettling Knowledge.
Right. Okay, but I couldn't see it. That is why I'm now. I told you, right? I told you if you can do it once, it kind of never comes back. It's gone forever. Hold on. Let me see. Okay. Right. All right. So can everyone see this now? Can you see the entire slide?
Yes, we can see it in the editor mode in PowerPoint, but that's fine. Yes, you can press present if you prefer that.
I did, but it says resume slideshow. Okay. Well, crap. There should be a presenter mode up top right here, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Never mind. This is what you'll see. So you're seeing the entire screen, right? Instead of just the big slide?
Yeah,
yes,
but it's
this
okay.
Is fine. This is
All
fine.
right, fine. Okay, here we go. So this is who I am. I'm a research specialist at the University of Science, and I work actually with the GUEST program, which is the Gender Equality Studies and Training program. It's a Category 2 center under the auspices of UNESCO. And I wanted to focus my my presentation today around basically the big major area that I do research on, which is on different kinds of violence. And because I'm a literature person, I'm going to focus it on literary texts and think through first just a really quick look at how we updated, decolonized the English honors syllabus in my home university, in Delhi University, in the late 80s, early 90s, and just a couple of the questions that we had in just overhauling an old curriculum and replacing it. Yeah, the first time we replaced it with a new one. And then I want to talk a little bit about my research and what I'm doing there. And then I'll end with a really short presentation, which I think both Frank and Rachel have seen before, but I've shortened it down on a particular text and how I teach it in class. So this is going to be more practical than theoretical. All right, so when we were looking at upgrading the syllabus in Delhi University, it hadn't been upgraded since the late 60s, early 70s. And and it was a very, very British heavy curriculum. So for those of you who don't know, if you do in the Indian system, which is based on the Cambridge system, you have an honors, right? So you have a 3-year degree and you do one subject, that's your honor subject. And you do a couple of, small, insignificant subsidiary things. So if you decide to do English honors, then you do 3 years of English literature. You do 8 courses in it. And the idea was to take you from the classics through to contemporary literature. So we started with the Bible and the Odyssey, and then we went through, medieval literature, Renaissance, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century, blah, blah. So it was extremely canonical, very, very British-centered, not just English. It was English as in British. And one of the things I think to remember about how that canon was constructed, and many of you may know this, Gauri Vishwanathan published her research on this back in the early 90s. The British canon comes to us through the Indian civil services in the late 19th century. So when it was decided that Indians could actually join the civil service while India was still under colonial rule, then they actually had to go back into English literature, that is British literature, and find texts that Indian people could study for the civil services exam. And until then, until the late 19th century, as far as I understand Vishwanathan's work, in England itself, in Eton and Harrow and Cambridge and Oxford and so on, you were taught the Greeks and the Latins as your classics, as literature worth studying and so on. That was canonical. But when they decided that they had to build a syllabus for Indians to study in India, then they started looking for British literature that basically glorified the nation, spoke well of the nation, talked about British as the nation, and so on. And there's this very clear agenda behind the texts that were selected. And so we had Chaucer and Shakespeare and Milton, Johnson, some of the 19th century novelists joining the ranks and being put out as literature worthy of being studied. As that's how the canon basically came into being for the Indian civil services. Until then, those things were actually not taught as canonical in the English system. So to compound the fact that it was, English literature, there was this extremely colonial sort of agenda behind the syllabus that I studied and the syllabus that, had been at work in the university in India. So that was part of it, that the canon itself was very colonial, but also we had to contend with the idea that the idea of canon itself needs to be decolonized. How do you pick? How do you choose? And I'll come to that in a minute. So the first thing we had to do was to update it, because the idea of the contemporary stopped 60 years before. Whenever you were doing it, anything that was closer was too recent, too young, not established, hadn't stood the test of time, and so on. So first we had to update everything. Of course, the main focus was to decenter the British focus, make it less Eurocentric. And in order to do that, you displaced you brought in not just Indian literature, but of course literatures from around the world. So to make it less Eurocentric, to decenter the British focus from it. And then to make that degree as inclusive as possible. So those are our three. I've chosen this very random photograph. It's taken outside my college, St. Stephen's, and it's a protest that some students were holding last year, where there was this whole spate of student-run protests all around the country. I should add, actually, very quickly, that back in the 80s, this is no longer really true, I think, at least not in Delhi, but back in the 80s, early 90s, I think maybe to the mid-90s, studying English literature itself in Delhi, in urban India, was this very elitist pursuit. It made you more cultured. It made you, it made you elite in a way in which studying history, studying economics, studying science did not, studying English literature. So there was still this very sort of colonial hangover with just the discipline itself. So when we started decolonizing and updating the curriculum, it wasn't just a question of what you wanted to get rid of, because, that was what happened. There was really no reason why there were a bunch of poets and novels, no matter how good, that really needed to be studied across the oceans and so on. There was this question of language. So there are, my department at Rutgers, where I did my PhD from, was called Literatures in English. And this has been true since the early 90s. I joined much later, but it was called Literatures in English, very much in recognition of this sort of decentering of the colonial, and creating this idea of English as in British honors. And so you studied everything in English, although a lot of it was in translation and so on. So I think, this is an interesting sort of topic right now, because Columbia University has very recently, that is a few weeks ago, decided that it's going to call its department Literatures in English, and it's very proud of itself. And we're all like, hurrah, but a couple of decades late. And then the problem with decanonization. If you are selecting texts for a curriculum, you are de facto canonizing. You are deciding this is worth teaching, thinking about, privileging over other texts. This one is not. And so when you set out to actually put together a syllabus for a university curriculum, you are canonizing, no matter what you do, no matter how many you include, no matter how broad your syllabus is, no matter how many options you give between papers and, choices for the student. The problem of picking 10 and selecting is very much part of canonization. And so I'm sure you recognize these two men. The one on top is Frederick Jameson, and the one below is Ejaz Ahmed. And so in 1990, oh my God, I'm bad with dates. Let's just say late 90s. Ejaz Ahmed's book came out in 1999. So Jameson must have been a little earlier. Anyway, Jameson makes this entire argument that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in which he says that all third world literature focuses on national allegories. And he was speaking basically in a very post-colonial kind of context. And he makes this entire argument about how it's a new literature and it's coming out, to the English-speaking world, and it's concerned with issues of nationhood. Most of the Asian colonies getting their independence in the 40s and 50s, most of the African ones in the 60s and early 70s, and so on. And so he says all third world literature is focused on national allegory. And of course, Ajaz Ahmad takes him to task over it and says, what do you mean third world? What do you mean all? What do you mean national allegory? And just breaks it down, in terms of region and language and culture, to say that even within one country, in India, there are so many hundreds of languages, there are so many regional literature, there's, this deep history of literature before colonization, and basically points up the enormous overstatement that Jameson is making. But to give Jameson his due, his statement was made in the context of rethinking American academia and its teaching of literature, to say that, there's all this other literature emerging and so on. So, but to keep that in mind, to keep this idea of what you pick and why you pick it. And we found, of course, that many of the texts that we chose were national allegories. There were texts that talked about nationhood, that talked about collective identity formation, that talked about the important topics in that sense. And so that, just to say that it's a messy area, that this idea of inclusion is good and needs to be done and was done, but in many ways you replicate canonical anxieties. And we can discuss this in more detail. One of the ways in which we tackled this was to change the structure of the syllabus. So you didn't have just your 8 main papers and 2 subsidiaries in related subjects, but you had a series of differently weighted courses that you did, which actually allowed you to expand your options into different kinds of literature and histories and so on. So we can talk about that in more detail, if you like, later. And then, of course, yes, just the context of the subaltern movement and post-colonial theory, which had, from the 80s, which had gained a lot of traction at the time, and how much this bolstered our exercise of decolonizing the curriculum. So my research since my PhD and in the many years since has focused on different kinds of violence and their narratives. I'm concerned by and large with what is the difference between one kind of violence and another. Let's say the violence of slavery in North America and the violence of the First World War, or state-sponsored violence, let's say in the Pinochet regime, and systemic violence that's built into the system, as in feudalism. So how are these different from each other? How is one kind of violence different from another? And then from there, how are they narrated? How does the kind of violence dictate a certain kind of narrative of that violence? Where do we talk about it? How do we talk about it? What are the stories we tell? Where do we tell them? To whom do we tell them? And then from there, to ask, how is our sense of collective identity formulated upon these narratives of violence? So if you want to say, what does it mean to be Chilean today? Why must we go back to the Pinochet regime, which is so recent? If you want to say, what does it mean to be African American? What does the place of slavery have to do with it? If you are Indian or Pakistani, what does the violence of partition have to do with our sense of collective identity formation? So to make those connections. And then to think about how writing in English, or at least being published in English. So of the books that I've given here, Beloved, of course, is, talks about slavery. Sula is about the First World War, at least begins, and that's what I focused on. Maxine Hong Kingston's Woman Warrior I chose because she talks about feudalism in China, among other things. The Joy Luck Club I chose because Amy Tan focuses on the siege of the invasion of Nanking just before the Second World War, and then House of Spirits because of the Pinochet regime and state-sponsored violence and the militant rebel and torture. And of all of these, Allendez is the only one that is actually translated in English. The rest are all written in English. But I chose Allendez also because there is a definitive English translation that circulates in English-speaking countries. And there are very complicated economies of literary production. Non-white women writing into the Anglophone publishing world, so this is largely in North America and in England and in English-speaking Europe. There is the question of audience. There is the question of the representation of self and country. There are some very problematic parts of this kind of decolonial approach to your writing, where when Morrison says that I'm writing from an African tradition, then I have to step back and say, what African tradition are you talking about? Is there such a thing? Morrison's own master's degree is in Faulkner. She's very much an Americanist by training. And so what is the meaning of this political move that is dressed up as a literary move, and where does it fit into my understanding of her book? When Kingston, presents this particularly dark picture of China, then the question that I had to ask of myself is, why should I expect the immigrant to present a faithful, realistic, inclusive picture of her home country? Is not the experience of an immigrant very often a violent one? Does she not have the right to write her own truth? If the country that she's leaving is a country that she can only leave, she can never go back to, then what is my problem as a lay reader with the presentation of this very one-sided and pretty negative view of the country? And so these are some of the questions that came up when I addressed some of these books. And if anyone's interested and has read them, we can go back to them and talk about them in more detail. They were not easy questions, I think, especially to think about in terms of being a woman of color doing her PhD in North America on a subject like this. So there was that. The other questions that, writing that this kind of group that I chose presented was, you're presenting the colonial experience to the colonizer. What is it that they need to know? Do you have to give them the whole truth? What part of the truth do you give? And why? How do you tell a certain kind of truth? And to whom are you telling it? What can you take for granted? What kind of things need a more detailed representation? And so you're constantly running the risk of exoticizing, of ghettoizing your experience and your knowledge when you write into another space. And I see this, we can discuss it also later if anyone's interested, but I see this a lot in contemporary Indian publishing, where there are certain kinds of books that get international awards, and they tell a story of a certain kind of India. And not that story is untrue, but, a slice of truth, not the whole truth. And then it encourages other people to write similar books because those are the ones that are rewarded and so on. So all of these issues that went into it. But a lot of my effort has been into decolonizing how we look at these events of violence and also how we look at trauma. So decolonizing trauma is one of the really interesting aspects of the research that I've been doing lately. I've been working on a book-length study called Invisible Texts, hidden and spectacularized colonial violence in Asia and Africa. And so I'm interested in this idea of hidden and spectacularized violence. I've been looking at what kind of violence gets a huge amount of circulation in public discourse, which one is kept alive in public memory, and which are allowed to die, which are actively hidden away. So I'm going to start with point number 4 actually here. And Frank talked about it in one of the earlier sessions that you had. When the survivors of the Mau Mau, uprising came to England, to the British Crown, and wanted reparations, and they were told basically, this never happened. It was not the way you remember it. And there were 5 of them, 5 survivors, of whom I think 2 or 3 survive now. And this was 2012. It was not that long ago, if I'm correct in my dates. And basically, the very little documentation that they had led to further documentation, or to the inference of further documentation. And then this entire thing called Operation Legacy basically blew open into public knowledge, where Operation Legacy was the name that they gave to destroying all documentation when a colony gained independence. So as Britain left a colony, they were told to destroy all the paperwork, anything, I quote, that might embarrass Her Majesty. So anything that was specifically racial or violent or discriminatory or whatever, racist, all evidence had to be destroyed. In fact, the documentation tells us that when the British were leaving Delhi, they started burning these documents. There's a memo that went out to the government to say, this is how you have to burn it. You have to destroy everything. There was a pall of smoke that was so heavy it hung over Delhi for a week because of the amount of stuff being burnt. And this was so embarrassing. It was literally sort of sending these smoke signals up into the sky to sort of declare your criminality. This was so embarrassing to Her Majesty's government that another memo went out. And this time the memo said, please stop burning it. This is very embarrassing. It's very public. Pack them into crates. And there were specific instructions of the size of the crate, how heavy it should be, what it should be made of, and to weigh it down, and then to take it down out and there was a specific nautical, measure given to beyond the current so that it doesn't sort of come flowing back, I suppose, and to sink it in the ocean so that it's out of sight and out of mind. And so there is, and this happens like all over Asia, it happens all over Africa as they're leaving. And it turns out that there are still a stack of papers that are kept in a vault in Britain somewhere. And so I go at this detail to say that there are some legacies, there are some histories that are actively erased. And there's really not a lot we can do about it. I remember one of the questions asked last time was, what can you do when you don't have any archives? And I think that there's a difference between colonialism and imperialism, where settler colonialism or colonialism of the kind that you had in much of Asia, at least in India, it's actually impossible to destroy, all evidence of something, because there is such a long and deep and wide, context of written archives that it's almost impossible to completely erase anything. Whereas it was actually much easier, let's say in the Belgian Congo, under imperialism to do this. And so to think about how some histories were sought, at least, to be entirely hidden away, and some that were spectacularized. And so part of what my interest in this idea of spectacularizing violence is that I don't know how many of you are interested and have done it, but there is a good amount of documentation that you can still see just online, if nowhere else, of photographs, documents, lists, archival papers, presentations, reports, all kinds of stuff of enormously brutal activities. So, for instance, in the Belgian Congo, if you did not produce as much rubber as you were supposed to in the day, or if you were truant and didn't do it, or if you ran when they caught you, or whatever, they would actually cut off your hand. And so they have like a basket full of hands. And so first of all, they collect them, they put them together, they create this physical spectacle, then they take photographs of it, and then those photographs circulate. So it's very much like lynchings in North America in the 50s and early 60s, where, you would have lynchings, but you would also have postcards that were made from photographs that were then sent around. So there is this compulsive creating of spectacle on the one hand, of certain kinds of violence, and then this compulsive hiding away of evidence of certain other kinds. And that's the kind of tension that I'm interested in, that I'm looking at, to see what does it have to do with a certain kind of colonization, what does it have to do with issues of race. And that's where I come to this idea of multidirectional memory. So I think it's 2009, it's now 10, 11 years old, but Michael Rothberg wrote this book called Multidirectional Memory, in which he basically says that because while acknowledging that the Holocaust has this enormous hold on the public imagination and an amazing amount of visibility in public discourse, and as we've seen over the last few years at least, there's more and more evidence in the public sphere of, people who are like us trying to say, what about this, this, and this? Why are these events not remembered? How is it that Hitler is a byword for evilness and slaughter and brutality, but Leopold of Belgium is not, etc. So Rothberg's argument, which I found interesting, was basically, he says that it's when you have competing events of this kind of colonial or other violence, they need not be in competition with each other. It's not as if you have to remember one thing at the expense of another. And he actually points to lots of these strands that connect them, and to people who've been researching one and are led to another, and so on. It's actually a very rich, very interesting sort of way of looking at public memory. I think that, I would take it further. I think that he has. I would want to talk about money and resources. Who can fund a museum of a particular atrocity? Who can publish in papers, and all of that. So there is a way in which you have to keep memory alive through institutional effort, through financed funding efforts, which does not happen in many cases, and many of those cases are from the colonies and imperial territories. Coming from that, to decolonize trauma studies, to say, whose trauma is looked at, which is kind of a corollary of what we're talking about. Whose trauma is legitimized and authorized. We still live in a world in which Black bodies are not seen to be capable of as much suffering, both physical and emotional, as other bodies. We see this in the feminist movement, sadly. We see this in so many other spaces. We see this in a lot of racist and, white supremacist conversation and so on. And so there is a privileging of certain kinds of trauma, and there is a privileging of certain kinds of racial trauma. And so there's been a huge movement lately in the last few years, to decolonize, trauma studies. And I find that really, really exciting. So I'm going to talk quickly about the 3 books we have here and why I've chosen these. And so I call this invisible text because I'm looking for places in literature where these events of violence have been narrated in some form, and why they're not recognized as what they clearly are. Why are they invisible even while being in such well-known texts as these? So I've chosen the famous ones. And what all of them have in common is the trope of the rape of the white woman. And as Salman Rushdie asked way back in 1984, when this Jewel in the Crown series first was made into a TV series, it's a quartet of 4 books by Paul Scott. And it came out in the 70s as part of what was called the Raj nostalgia, when the last of the British colonies was becoming independent. There was this enormous public sort of literary outpouring of texts about the British Raj in India. And this is one of those. It's one of the best known. And in 84, it was made into a serial which was extremely popular and well received. And Salman Rushdie asks, he says, I don't get this trope of the white woman being raped. You would imagine that since this is a white man in India colonizing the country, surely the allegory would be of the Indian woman being raped. Woman as country, Indian, white man, etc. He said, I don't understand this business of why is this recurring trope of the white woman and the rape of the white woman. And so it was one of the things that I found really fascinating, and I have a whole theory that we can talk about later. But I went looking into that, and I found archives that had been, I did not personally find them, but there was a book about them from a historian, archives of interviews and transcripts that were made immediately after the 1857 revolution, in which one after another, British officers come out and say that the thought, in this particular incident that I'm talking about, that the thought of rape never crossed the native's mind. And I was fascinated by this, because otherwise the native is always set up as desirous of the English woman. King Kong is desirous of Jessica Lange. So, who is exempt then from desiring the English woman, the white woman? A lot of the rhetoric of war and vengeance is based on this, look, this is a piece of her skirt. This is what the native did to her. Look, this is a lock of her hair. It's all this fetishization of the white woman to spur the, English soldiers on to greater and greater acts of brutality and vengeance. And in that context, to say of this one incident that the thought of rape never crossed the native's mind, it really hit me. And so I have this whole theory about hidden violence, and a couple of the incidents where the British were bested by Indians are seen as this very hidden kind of violence, and they're sort of hidden away as well. And one of the really interesting things that I found there was the role of photography. So I'm not a film person, and I know very little about it, but I'm sure there are people out there who know more about it. But there are photographs of places where these massacres took place. And there's a kind of doubleness of vision that I find fascinating if you look at it from this sort of decolonial lens, where on the one hand, there seems to be an urge to reproduce that place as untouched and innocent. So, along the banks of this lake was this massacre that took place. And the lake, you see, is this lovely, peaceful, calm thing as it exists today. And there's a kind of move to return it to its innocence before it was violated in this way by blood and bloodshed and so on. And at the same time, it's also an urge to reproduce the land as witness, because the dead are not witness. The dying are not able to give testimony to it. And the land itself is like an eternal witness through, the 150 or 200 years since then. And so photography has sort of played this very interesting role here. And again, we can come back to it and talk about it. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I'm coming on to my last little bit, which is that what do we want to achieve pedagogically? So I see myself essentially as a classroom person, as an instructor, someone who brings stuff to bunches of people and goes through it with them. What do I want to achieve when I bring decoloniality to my teaching? So, of course, to be inclusive, of course, to think of syllabi, of course, to think of a curriculum that is decolonized, of course, but also to disrupt. To take a reading, any reading, let's take white colonial male writers. How should we read them is the question. So very often it's how do we read decolonially rather than how do we have decolonial material before us. To make connections, to say if Lord Bertram in Mansfield Park, Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, is always absent, and Austen is, never happy with the absentee father and the Lady Bertram who sits on her sofa and never does anything to correct her children. She mentions several times that the reason Lord Bertram is not there is because he's in Antigua. where he has sugar plantations. And that the journeys to Antigua are very dangerous across the seas and so on. He's gone for long periods of time, and the older son goes there and becomes sick and comes back, and so on. And so to make these connections, I think Spivak and Saeed have very interesting papers, again, dating from the early 90s, about the Victorian novel and these goods. So to make these connections, it's a little paragraph, it's a sentence thrown away somewhere, to pull it out and to make that connection. And if we do that, we ask different questions of our text. And when we ask different questions, of course, our perspective on the text deepens, widens, and so on. There are things that we don't want to do pedagogically in a classroom or through teaching. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I will defend to my dying breath Shakespeare's right to be on any canon anywhere. Regardless of what we may find about him. And those are some things that I have very heated discussions about. But I was very interested in two examples that I saw recently. One was very recent. I don't know if anyone followed it, but Gone with the Wind was taken off of HBO, Netflix, anyway, one of these. Because it was a staple on their thing as classics, and then clearly there was this thing of how it's racist and so on. But instead of taking it away, they had an hour-long sort of documentary kind of thing, giving the historical context, having interviews with people, explaining what it is about the movie that is racist and so on, and then putting it back with that attached thing, with that preamble. And that's one way to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. A colleague of mine in India, he was talking about, this, how to do this, how to deal with your most beloved people being thrown off their pedestals by something or the other. And he was thinking of Neruda, who I love. And he was speaking of Neruda's poem, I Want to Explain a Few Things Which I Love Dearly. And quote it and so on whenever I can. And he was saying that in his class on creative writing, he wanted to show the impact that line breaks can make. And so he was talking about the end of the poem, which I'm sure those of you who've read it will remember. Come and see the blood in the streets, and then come and see the blood in the streets, come and see the blood in the streets. And then he said that he read his biography, and he read the bit where Neruda talks about raping a Sri Lankan woman. And he asked, along with his students, they basically decided that not that we should stop reading Neruda or that his poems are not good, but if you want to use an example in a class to show the impact of line break, there are 100 other poets you can use. Why would you put a person in that hallowed space, which kind of gives him a pedestal? And so that was one way of thinking about what do we do when the light of decoloniality shows up some of the literatures that we love in the way that they do. And that's an ongoing question that I think it would be great to talk about. One of the things I did in class was to take, a few years ago when it came out, Taylor Swift's Wildest Dreams, that video, and there was a big hubbub around it when it came out. I don't know if anyone noticed. I did, because my kids love Taylor Swift. And this whole business about, reproducing Africa as this untouched, pristine land with no people on it, that the white man can just go in and have their wildest dreams in. So that's also something we can come back to. I'm going to take a few minutes and just talk about Jane Eyre and how I teach it in class. And so I talked about disruption, and what I do is I treat it as a disrupted narrative, both in terms of, the disrupted narrative of the white woman's whatever, but also growth and so on, but also just in terms of the text. I start in the middle of the text, where Jane Eyre comes face to face with Bertha Mason, and this little passage that I've put out here, you can see the alterity. This is my wife, you look at her, she's the gambols of a demon, and here's this young English woman that I wanted to marry. So, you set up this whole alterity. It's right at the center of the novel. And the question I asked myself when I teach Jane Austen in class is, how is the white woman built? Upon what? What is she constructed from? And where are the examples of or models of the white woman that that are used to construct this English woman? And so, interestingly, the voices of rebellion are not English. They are when Jane says, "Speak, I must." She's tied to the chair in the way that Bertha Mason is tied to her chair. And what's interesting is that Bertha Mason is always given, well, not always, but from the 70s, from Gilbert and Gubar's watershed work of the Mad Woman in the Attic, is seen as representative of the white Victorian English woman. Whereas, of course, Bertha Mason is not white and not Victorian and not English, and she's not even treated as a woman. And she's representative of something very different. So where do the voices of rebellion come from? And they are, Jane sits behind the curtain like a Turk, not like a young English girl or an English boy or English anything, white anything. So not what are the voices of rebellion, but whose are the voices of rebellion? Whose oppression lays the foundation for her oppression, and the importance of speech and the refusal to be a subaltern. So if we see Bertha Mason not as representative of white women in Victorian England, but as a rupture, she's not a connecting symbol between white women. She is a rupture in this idea of who the white woman is. Decolonizing our reading sort of situates her at the center as a real person and not as a symbol. And then her colonial context becomes the central context and not just something that Rochester has to deal with. She becomes less of a plot, trope and more of the actual meat of the book. And these are just different ways in which Bertha Mason has been, depicted. And so Alterity's women are the others of the white woman that are set up are the Turkish harem girl in her silks and luxuriousness, or the Indian woman who will commit sati out of devotion for her husband. And so the anxiety in the book is that if sexuality and sensuality are marked as Turkish, and if devotion and loyalty is marked as Indian, how does the English woman claim these? How do we make these English qualities? Because they're qualities that we want, certainly, in our English woman. But now that the English man has gone out and colonized these places and split the person of the woman into these different raced categories, how does the English woman claim them? And so she claims them as others. And then, of course, it's not just white against anything. It's not just a question of race. It's also within Europe. How is the English woman different from other white women? And so you have Céline Varens, who's at the far left. And the French are given to us as floozies. I don't know if anyone uses that word anymore, but I love it. She's a courtesan. She's a performer. She's sexually promiscuous. She's a floozy. She's immoral. She betrays Rochester. She's disloyal, blah, blah. Her daughter Adele is, because she's kind of also Rochester's daughter, if not biologically, which we think she is, but at least because he adopts her, if nothing else, brings her to England. And that entire metaphor is, we shall see if she doesn't grow better in English soil. Is being English a question of birth? Is everyone born in England English? Because heaven forbid, look at all these natives coming into England. Would they be English? No. It's English culture. If you raise a child in England, will she not become British? There's Blanche Ingram in the ringlets over there, who is all things good English, but also unethical. There's Miss Temple at the bottom right. And you might think, why is Miss Temple not a good role model for English women? Well, Miss Temple gets married at the end. But right in the beginning of the novel, actually. And this is that she gets married at a point at which Jane is standing at the same school window and looking out beyond the last horizon to a world in which she can have an active role. That's her dream. And when Miss Temple gets married and is looking cooingly into her husband's eyes, then she ceases to be a role model for Jane. They're the two sisters, Jane's cousins, Eliza and what's the other one's name? Anyway, the Reed sisters. And they're given to us as, of course, they're English, but they're sort of at two extremes. One is Calvinist and nun-like and so on, and totally joyless and cheerless. And the other is extremely frivolous and foolish and vain and so on. So clearly, these are not role models. And then there's Helen, who's at the bottom left. And Helen is saintly. Helen is too good for this world. She's not going to last very long. Of course, she dies young of tuberculosis. Helen is too saintly. She's not a woman of the world. And so these are all the not Janes that are within the white world. And so how to then expand Jane's consciousness? And I'm going to argue that Jane's consciousness is expanded the way that the empire expands, for the same reasons, with the same kind of logic and rhetoric. Why can't a woman have activity in her life like a man? And her consciousness is expanded as colonization and imperialism expands its own horizons and its own world. Her dreams, I'm calling them colonial, we can debate it. But to go forth into its expanse, this is the language of empire, where you assume that everywhere you go is yours to go. Very much like Taylor Swift and Wildest Dreams. It's an open land. All it's got is very friendly lions and leopards and giraffes. Why wouldn't you go there? They actually love you. There's this whole scene where she's sitting with her, material of her dress flying, and there's a lion right behind her who's clearly very friendly and happy to have her there. And so it's the language of empire. Your right, indeed your legitimate ambition to go forth into its expanse. In order to what's the word I'm looking for? In order to expand your potential, to live to your entire potential. And so when she marries Rochester at the end, there is there's the connection of the pyres where Bertha Mason jumps off into the fire that she's created in order to kill Rochester, which is like an inverse sati, where she wants to kill the husband, but she also jumps into the pyre thinking she will kill herself on his flaming pyre. There's the bit where she comes and sets fire to Rochester's bed, and Jane saves Rochester from dying on that fire. But I could argue that the house that Jane lives in at the end is built on pyres. It's built on these other women, and Rochester is in a sense dead, in the sense that he's not the Rochester he used to be. He's a very, very different Rochester that she comes to. And Jane herself is not the Jane she used to be. She lives in Ferndean Manor, which was considered too, I quote, insalubrious for even Bertha Mason to be kept in. And so there is this entire ending that we can read, which is a very different ending if you read it decolonially. It forces you to ask questions that reading it straight out, as a story of the young moral Jane sort of living her life according to moral things and being rewarded at the end with the love of her life. It's a very different story if you read it this way. So I am actually done. That's my presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Giti. And Frank's internet is a little bit dicey, so I will step in. Oh, but there you go. Wonderful, Frank. I see you nodding.
I don't know if I took very long or not, because I just couldn't see anything other than my screen.
It was gripping. Perfect. Nobody noticed the time. And so thank you very much. And you just laid so much on the table there, and that move from, doing the decolonial work or thinking about how to decenter Europe in Delhi to actually what you do in your own personal research to teaching was just such a lovely arc. And I know that people will probably have questions about each of the three stages of that arc. I did just quickly ask in the chat, is everybody familiar with the basic plot of Jane Eyre? Because if people aren't, we can quickly run over it. Just so we're all on the same page, a young English governess who was raised in a family not her own and estranged goes to be governess in a very wealthy man's house. There's a secret in the attic. It's his former wife from the Caribbean who's going mad. And but the governess doesn't know this. He proposes to her. All is revealed. She runs off to live with her cousins, nearly becomes a missionary in Africa to save the heathen, but sticks to her feminist values, goes back to find that the mad wife in the attic has tried to burn down the house and burned herself, and then the governess is rewarded with the burned, hideously disfigured and no longer very rich man at the end. This is a very short synopsis, but you can and selective synopsis, but you can read it yourself. But I think I actually also was trained in literature and remember reading that and then having the moment where I read the mad woman in the attic as suddenly being this estranged, alienated wife, and having that kind of questioning and unpacking and revelation. So thanks for giving us the decolonial one. And I have some questions, but I really want to privilege the voices in the Zoom room. Or the Starleaf portal. So so is there anybody, you can just raise your hand or unmute yourself, who has a question for Giti? Wouter, go ahead.
Yes, so I was wondering, you were talking about the redesigning of the curriculum in Indian or in Delhi universities. With the new rise of nationalism and the Modi government being more and more on the Hindutva, I think, is that the right pronunciation?
Yep.
How are they approaching this issue about decolonizing, Indian universities? And literature specifically, I mean, it's virtually incredibly important.
Yeah, thank you. You've touched a nerve, I'm afraid.
I'm sorry.
If I explode, you will excuse me. So, yes, the right wing began its campaign a few years back by actually forcibly, and by forcibly I mean they went into the head of department's room and took the book off of his shelf and burnt it. It's actually an essay which it's called the 300 Ramayans, and so the Ramayana, as you might know, is considered a religious epic, right? It's one of the two big epics. The Mahabharata is the one with the war, and the Ramayana is the one with the Lord Ram, and there is an extremely syncretic, very rich culture of the Ramayana in India. So there are literally 300 different versions across the centuries and across the country. And there's a wonderful essay by A.K. Ramanujam who writes about this. And he talks about the syncretic, sort of history of religion and epic telling and blah, blah, around the country. Of course, this is not to the Hindutva's ideology. And they literally went in and they physically took it, hurting the head of department in the process, and burnt it, and actually managed to get it taken off the syllabus. Not only did it get it taken off the syllabus, but Oxford University Press stopped printing it. There's another book that came out recently, a few years ago, on Hinduism and Hindu iconography and gods and so on, and the name is escaping me right now, but she's an American woman, Audrey Trishkin. And her book was banned because of its cover art or something. What does she know about it? But the government is basically doing two things to college curricula. One of them is to privatize it. So we know that along with conservative fundamentalism comes, big business and a sort of economic conservatism. And so in privatizing it, they're trying to change the entire system to fit into an American calendar and into the American 4-year major minor system. And I haven't done my BA there, but I've taught in it, and I think it's a great system. It has its own merits, but it won't work in a government-funded university like Delhi University. So when I taught in Delhi University, we have tutorials which are, small groups of students that you meet once a week, right? And we try to keep the numbers really small. In my own 20 years of teaching, it's grown from 3 to about 6 people per tutorial so that they get a lot of personal attention. This has been a huge bone of contention because the bigger the tutorial groups, the fewer my classes, the fewer people the college has to hire, right? That's how micromanaged classes are and teaching hours are in Delhi University. There is no way that you can have an array of 70 courses or even 20 that an incoming student can choose from. There is no money for it. There are not enough classrooms. I've taken tutorials on the steps. There is no real estate. There is no money. It is not possible to institute this. And so what they do is to dumb it down. So as I said, you don't want to get me started, but that's one of the things that the right-wing government does, quite apart from its Hindutva agenda. Sort of this economic conservatism comes with it. And the entire focus of university education is to produce ants for industry. You want people to be able to do Excel sheets. You don't really care whether they can read Chaucer from back to front and reveal gender biases in it. That's not what they want. And
those people only create trouble.
Thank you. Exactly. And God knows we would not want that, would we? People think for themselves. What do you think higher education is for anyway? But an interesting example actually is that they set up this huge outcry that why don't you teach religious texts? You should be teaching the Ramayana in your classrooms. The fact is that we do. There are extracts from the Mahabharata and from the Ramayana in the English, honors degree. And of course, if you put a text like that in my hands, as I say, it's how you teach, it's not what you're teaching. So I'm going to talk about gender. I will talk about race. I will talk about caste. I'm going to talk about power hierarchies. And so you should be very careful what you wish for. But you are right. They are rewriting school textbooks. They are whitewashing entire histories. So the 300 years of the Mughal dynasty is being demonized and washed out of public discourse. Road names are changed because they were named after these emperors. And, so there is this very, very textbook fascist right-wing stuff happening.
But that is so far, as I understand, mainly aimed at the Mughal and Muslim
yes.
Well, part of the whole syncretic culture. How do they approach the colonial and English legacies?
So, because they want big business, they're not going to paint the colonizing culture as demonic, the way that they do the Mughals. So in Bollywood movies, you will actually have these really sort of savage-looking, people who eat with their hands, and dance in these strange ways and so on. But they are very anti-conversion. So they are anti-Christian when it comes to their own tiny home politics, when it comes to demonizing the local missionary, because in order to, because you have to set up the enemy of Hinduism. So their slogan is, Hindu khatre mein hai, which is the Hindu is in danger. The Hindu is 80% of the country. 80% of India is Hindu, 15% is Muslim. This has been true for the last 70 years. It has not changed. For all the bogey that they set up of, they're going to overrun you. They have 4 wives. They have so many children. Look at them. Look at them. It's like the Browning of America. It's this constant bogey that's held out. So when they want to create this sort of anti-Hindu demon, then your Christian missionary is a very convenient person to aim it at. Otherwise, they're not really anti-Christian. So they're not interested in demonizing England.
Right. They want to keep England at their side.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's where the money is. So Modi will go and hug.
Hey, there's Kitty.
Yeah. So I'm gonna I mean, this is fascinating, and also raises interesting issues about can history be erased by changing street names? There are all sorts of politics around changing street names, and people on every kind of level of every spectrum, every area of the political spectrum who worry about the changing of street names or who embrace it. But I actually wanted to turn to Frank's question, which I think you touched on in your presentation. Frank pointed out or asked, is decanonization decolonization? And I think you talked about the process of selection as canon making anyway. Yeah. So, but maybe you want to elaborate. Is decanonization decolonization?
Yes and no. Yes, it is, to the extent that we recognize a particular strand of colonization and we recognize what it does, how it, as colonization. And so certainly in decentering the British and the European from the syllabus, I think, yes, it does do that up to a point. But, as I said, up to a point. So, for instance, we don't recognize the distinction between England and Ireland. Yeats is presented as part of modern British poets, in spite of the poor man's fulminating against England all his life. Beckett is given to us in the English translation very much as an English poet. And unless you're interested, you're not going to go in. And so there is a lot of uncritical lumping together there, which happens. And no, it doesn't. It's not decolonization, because after all, when we picked those texts that were going to replace the British ones, we did think about Jameson's categories. We did think about national allegory. We did think about books that talk about India as nation and collective identity formation and so on. We did look at books that had stood the test of time, when we put them into the thing. So in a sense, the whole package of saying that you can learn this particular discipline over 8 courses within 3 years is kind of fraught with these problems anyway. And the best you can do is when you go into the classroom, you make the student aware of this and get them to deal with it. So that's my very non-committal answer to your question.
Well, I think it's an interdisciplinary answer too, because at the minute you start exposing the foundational assumptions of your discipline, and I say discipline as discipline as we understand it in the European context, in the academy produced in the 19th century, right. Then I think, and even saying that is like, okay, well, history isn't just the history of von Ranke or whatever. What assumptions are we making when we structure our courses this way? And I think that in itself, even if you don't then change the course, critiquing the categories is a decolonizing act. And let's be honest, it's the most decolonization that some people can do with the extremely difficult work pressure or institutional kind of resistance. Then actually raising these questions is a starting point for sure. I had a question actually, but I will privilege other people's questions, but you mentioned that you mostly work with literatures in English, global literatures in English, and the only work in translation you use is Isabel Allende's because it's a kind of sanctioned translation. Right. And I wondered if you wanted to talk us through your reasoning on that.
Those were the books that I had done for my doctoral work. And I didn't touch upon it, although I wanted to, but I was running, late. But I wanted to look also at how you can gender decolonial readings, and so I was looking at women's narratives. Partly because when you think about violence, then violence is gendered. Women receive and do violence in very different ways from men. And are the subject of different kinds of violence because of the woman's body being, culture bearer and inscribed and so on. And so I chose women's texts. And I chose texts that were bestsellers in an Anglophone audience. So I wanted to look at the connection between collective identity formation and the collective. So it's a fact that although Toni Morrison won the Nobel, Beloved was a best-selling book, but its numbers were not huge. And then Oprah Winfrey put it on her book club list. And boom, 2 million sales within a week. Right. And so I wanted also to look at that connection to say that when a writer creates a collective identity, is she taking the collective along with her? Or is this an ivory tower collective identity? How many people are with Morrison when she talks about writing for my tribe? You know, Morrison very clearly says, I'm not writing for everyone out there. You read my books, you love me, that's fine. But I'm writing for my tribe. Am I her tribe? No. I'm not part of the universe in which truths are universally acknowledged of Jane Austen's, right? And so, yeah, so I wanted to look at that tension to say, what happens when you're writing into this kind of Anglophone bestseller kind of publishing industry? What are the connections over there? How influential are these texts? Does the woman warrior influence the way that young Chinese American girls are treated in schools? Do they get bullied in the same way? Does it change the way that people think of Chinese American women? So what is the connection between the bestseller status and the book in that sense? Also, I mean, English is my first language. Of course, I read and write and speak Hindi fluently, and it's my mother tongue. As I constantly say, I scold my kids in Hindi. So, they know I'm really annoyed when it turns to Hindi. But English is my first language. It's how I was educated. So,
any other questions? Frank has one. He also has a brilliant comment in the chat. He wants Oprah to support him.
I can't see the chat, right?
Okay. You can only see the chat if you downloaded the program.
Okay, never mind. I'm not touching anything.
No, that's. I wouldn't.
No.
I was just wondering about your comment that you would defend having Shakespeare in the curriculum, which was a comment that really struck me. In the sense that I don't think we here as a group, but I think a lot of people tend to think about decolonization. There was this sort of comment in the UK by one of these ministers, I forgot her name. Sort of decolonization is often seen as like a project of destruction, while I think most of us who are engaged with this on an academic level are more concerned with providing a fuller picture of what essentially has been produced over time, right? So this really struck me as a comment that I found interesting, and it connects with this other question I had about this whole debate now in the US about the cancellation of Dr. Seuss and all these sort of writers. I'm just wondering, how do you what's your position on this? Because one of the things that I always struggle with is Hergé and Tintin. So I'm Belgian, as such, that doesn't really matter.
Yeah. And I grew up on Tintins, believe it or not.
Okay,
so did I.
Yeah, but one of the things with Hergé, right, if you go to the museum, is the man as a writer and as an artist and as a person evolves immensely throughout his life. So, he starts as, somebody who has these very racist views on other cultures, then goes to sort of an anti-Semitic phase during the war, which produces like this weird cartoons. But then, like in the afterward period, all of a sudden becomes really concerned with making his depictions of other cultures as realistic as possible, right? With all the flaws that come with it. And I'm not here to defend anything, but I'm just wondering, how do we struggle? How do we really integrate that as well in these debates about the decolonization of curriculum? How do you integrate the fact that a lot of these people just evolve over the course of their lives? A young person of 20 isn't the person who's 70 and realized that he's made a lot of mistakes.
Absolutely, I'm with you, Frank. It's the struggle is very real. I think, the latest one over the last few years has been with Gandhi, right? When you talk about evolution, so it is true that he made all these really racist remarks when he was in South Africa. But it is equally true that he rethinks them and changes his view as he gets older. And so do we take down his statue? I think, sure, if Gandhi's statue is in your hometown in, wherever he was, where he made these remarks, you have a complete right to take it down. But I think that it's worth looking, as you say, at the evolution, right? These are human beings. And if we're going to do biographical criticism, which we do, right, then we have to take that entire biography into account. You can't sort of cherry pick one thing or the other. But, as with, I think these are like case by case decisions that any researcher or teacher needs to make. So as someone doing policy, I don't know, do you want to ban Shakespeare from classrooms? I don't know. If you're a policy person, you have to say yes or no. For me, I think that for that example with Neruda, are you going to stop teaching or reading Neruda? Maybe not, but you certainly don't have to use him for that particular thing, in which you could use lots of other people. The only reason that you're using Neruda is because he is famous. But for your purposes, for that class to show the impact of line break in poetry, you could use a number of other people. And so these are micro decisions. And I think you're very right. You do have to. When I teach Eliot, for instance, T.S. Eliot, who, every time I teach the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock or the Wasteland, the skin, the hair rises on the back of my neck because it is so absolutely fabulous. But when I teach Sweeney Among the Nightingales, I tell them how anti-Semitic it is. And we talk about his anti-Semitism, and we talk about, whatever the issues may be with it. If I were redoing the curriculum, I would just take that poem out. But I think that, taking it out may not be the answer. Maybe the answer is to bring it to class and to show everyone what it is rather than to hide it away. I've had an ongoing conversation with people very dear to me about Joseph Conrad. And, after Achebe came out with his critique of Conrad's work, but especially of Heart of Darkness, to say that it is racist in various ways. And I think that it is entirely possible to be anti-imperial, but also racist. To say that you should not ill-treat this species, but that doesn't mean that the species is equal to me. It's possible to do both, and that was a realization, I think, in itself. We just assume that all these things went together, but they don't. I've had a long-standing debate on Heart of Darkness. Is one of the reasons I put the book there is because I think that he is actually much deeper into the issue of race than we give him credit for. And so let's say that for Heart of Darkness, I'm willing to go out there and defend it, to say that, in fact, it's not racist. And there are books that you can do that about, but with Conrad, I have found this to be a losing battle. It's, for me, I've even been told that for you to actually go in and, look at the text and its nitty-gritties and close read it to prove that he's not racist is itself a colonial activity. Why do you want to resurrect this man? So there's all these minefields, that you're negotiating. I think there are some people that I would take Dickens out. But that's only because I'm annoyed with Dickens. Tennyson, whom I love. Tennyson and Dickens, around 1857, when the revolution happens in India, write the most horrific tracts. It's the equivalent of Conrad's Exterminate the Brutes. I was not taught this when I was taught Tennyson and Dickens. What do I do with that information? Right? And so my answer is, again, very non-committal. I think that we treat each thing on its own merit. And so I think, maybe it's better that I take Sweeney into the classroom and show people what Eliot is capable of. I think that Eliot, like Shakespeare, is good enough to keep in the classroom, because they're saying such important things. I can't talk about existentialism without talking about T.S. Eliot. I can't talk about British drama or any drama without talking about Shakespeare. And so, so that's my I think it's a game of compromises. This is why I said that what do you want to do in the classroom? What do you want to achieve pedagogically? And I don't want to cleanse the classroom, to take out everything that is wrong with people, because we'll have nothing left. But I don't think it should be a destructive exercise. It should be constructive. I should be able to say, when Shakespeare says that she's like a jewel in an Ethiop's ear, then we need to be very careful where we place that Ethiop. What was the place of the Moor in the 16th century? What was Shakespeare talking about when he said Ethiop? Was he necessarily saying that, they're ugly because they're black? What is it that he's saying? I think I think it's more about how you teach rather than what you teach. I think it's immaterial what you teach.
And I think that's so valuable too, because one of the sort of criticisms sometimes leveled at the decolonial project, particularly when we come to decolonizing the curriculum, is that it is this form of cancel culture and that it's unsophisticated and that we just want to erase the past, which is always funny to historians because you can't do that. You can try and sink the crates at the bottom of the sea, but then somebody like Caroline Elkins will come along and find them in a British archive somewhere. But or there are traces of the past, as you said, all around us. But I think the way that you're framing it now is so helpful. Disrupt, connect, contextualize, make the assumptions obvious. And I think that has so much more nuance and sophistication than these conversations are often credited with. And it's sort of like, I kind of wish people would be watching this to, realize that we're not all, I don't know, Medusa-headed gorgons trying to destroy everything.
No, the real danger is letting people set the terms of the debate. So the minute that they call it cancel culture and we accept that term, we're done for. There is nothing cancel about it. You're just asking for accountability. You're not saying, how can I cancel J.K. Rowling, right? How can I cancel T.S. Eliot? You can't cancel these people. These are famous people. The minute, and I noticed this when in the 90s, the right wing first started making inroads into Indian public discourse. They would call, there was a demolition of a mosque. And they would call it the disputed structure, right? And really, it's not a disputed structure; it's a mosque. Stop calling it a disputed structure, right? But so the minute that you let people set the terms of the debate, you've lost. Next time someone says, you're like, "What do you mean cancel? Is it a plane ticket? What are you talking about?"
Yeah, I'm being silenced, scream many people loudly from nationwide platforms. Did
you see that letter that was written? I'm being silenced. Literally on everyone's websites and on the front page.
Washington Post. Yeah, no. I have two hands here, and I'm going to ask Ava because we haven't heard from her yet. And then, Wouter, if we have time, we'll get to you. But I am aware that people have a whole variety of commitments. Ava, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a point about setting the terms of the debate, and I was going to ask a question, but I'm afraid like the 2 minutes remaining are not going to be sufficient to deal with it. But also the whole, how these debates are so often formulated in binary terms, and how I feel like these are the only two camps you have to discuss these things, and that when you try to do something different, you end up in this sort of oblique thing where you cannot say anything. But then, for example, I work on the Belgian Congo, and I'm recently looking into things about like philosophy, Africans, Europeans, and the sort of African intellectuals appropriating Greek mythology. Is that a good thing? Are they reclaiming something, or are they just copying, the colonizer? So again, these sort of debates that fall between that sort of binary, and I'm struggling to sort of, I want to say something interesting about this, but in this debate that's so binary, like I just kind of fall between the holes of the net. But again, it was more a comment of, okay, I'm all glad we're all thinking in the same direction, but how do you, it's much easier when you sort of scream, I'm being silenced, then you get everyone's attention. But if you sort of want to, do not speak on the terms of that debate. then nothing happens, and you're talking to 5 other people on Twitter.
Yeah.
So,
No, I completely feel. I feel for you entirely, and you're absolutely correct. I think that these debates are so high definition. It is either or, and they're given in such binarized, rhetoricized terms that anyone who wants to be complex and subtle and if you actually know something about it and you have information and data and ideas, your voice is lost because you're not part of this screaming match. And I think this is something that happens to academics all the time. We have to reduce ourselves to sound bites, to make an impact, and it kills us to do it because you know that this is not what you're supposed to be doing. Yeah.
Well, that's a wonderful refusal to be a soundbite. Although if anybody is looking for incisive, incredible soundbites, I hear MC Hammer has quite the Twitter account these days. So one of his soundbites is make sure you take the measure of the measurer. And of course, he's talking about colonial statistics. And so apparently he is getting into decolonization in a big way. There we go.
And we can't stop him.
Okay, I think that is a signal that we have so thoroughly enjoyed our productive discussion that we almost want to go into Boral mode, into drinks mode without ceasing. But we do need to stop. So I would just like to thank Giti for an incredibly rich talk. We will be putting it on YouTube, and I know that there's a lot for me still to unpack in it. And also the discussion was wonderful. And Giti, you can tell it's a wonderful talk when the discussion just won't stop. So thank you again. Thank you everybody for joining us, and watch out for the next seminar in the series, which the incredible Larissa is just going to post into the chat for us and will proudly display on Twitter as well. And I think that's it from me. Frank, any last words?
No, thank you so much, Giti, for an excellent talk, which really struck the right balance between an analytical depth and insightful examples that really got the discussion going. This was one of the best talks we had already, so I think it will be difficult for the next person to top this conversation. And I think the next talk will be on history again. And it will be next month because we have these monthly installments. But thank you so much, Giti. This was excellent. This was great.
Thank you, all of you. And applause for the good work that you're doing.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.